Pushing the limits of the Super NES. The Super NES needs no introduction, and neither do most of its celebrated top-tier classics, so in this Pushing the Limits video, I'm going to go rooting through the jumble in Nintendo's dustiest attics to come back with an armful of games that don't get so much attention. Not just for the sake of being different, but because, frankly, so many of the most impressive limit-pushing Super NES games seem to have been completely forgotten, and just to add an extra bit of spice, I'm leaving out any games that made use of those famous enhancement chips, co-processors in the cart that expanded the Super NES's capabilities. There's none of that here, it's all running on the stock hardware. Let's hit the ground running with Super Dimension Fortress Macross Scrambled Valkyrie, to give it its more or less English name. Yes, it's based on the very long-running Macross mecha franchise. If you're a fan, it probably helps, but this absolutely stands up on its own merits. No knowledge of the series required. A game that shows just what the Super NES was good at, a 16-bit carnival of high-colour pixel flinging that few games managed to match. This system may not be remembered for its shooters particularly, but it did have a few, and this Japan-only release has got to be one of the very best, despite being overlooked for so long. They called it the Super NES, and that's really what it was, a souped-up super version of Nintendo's original console, based around many of the same principles. Like the NES, its graphics were tile-based, made up of predefined blocks arranged on the screen to make the final image, but unlike the NES, it could have multiple background layers, separate fields of tiles that could be moved and manipulated independently, almost like the acetate cells of traditional animation. We can see here the three different layers that go together to make the graphics from level 2 of this game, the clouds and the landscape. Each of these can be scrolled along independently at different rates, giving the classic 16-bit parallax effect. Widely used, yes, but looking especially superb here, augmented by another technique that the Super NES had in its armoury: raster effects. These were basically techniques that allowed the image on the screen to be changed as it was being drawn, opening the door to a whole range of graphical tricks. The NES could do this kind of thing with a bit of coaxing, but the Super NES's capabilities were much improved. HDMA, or Horizontal Direct Memory Access, allowed the system to make changes to what was happening in the graphics chip in the very brief window of time that occurs between one horizontal line of pixels being drawn and the next one appearing on the screen. It's this feature that's responsible for the nice looking and slightly eye-popping depth effect that we can see here. Two of the background layers are split into a number of separate strips using this technique and scrolled at different rates, the two separate elements working together to make this look seamless. Another bit of pop the Super NES could add was transparency, or maybe translucency would be a better name. One background layer could affect the colour of the layer below it without completely obscuring it, great for doing stuff like water and glass. Scrambled Valkyrie does a particularly nice trick with this in level 3 with that rising water, augmented once again with a HDMA effect to give it that ripple. This game is absolutely stuffed with this sort of high-level leverage of the system's capabilities, looking gorgeous throughout, and despite the pizzazz, there's very little slowdown in evidence either, something that plagued some other Super NES shooters. A game that seems destined to remain obscure despite being one of the very best of its type on the system. Another thing that's no doubt destined to remain obscure is my Patreon, which I've just recently set up. If you would like to support me on YouTube, well, that would be greatly appreciated. Have a look at the link below, or one that pops up somewhere hereabouts. And if you don't want to do that, well, maybe you could subscribe if you haven't done already. Okay, let's bounce off in a different direction after that rather brazen appeal for cash and talk about On the Ball. Known as Camel Try in Japan, for some reason this could easily have been tailor-made for the Super NES, but in fact it's an arcade conversion, and a good one too. A game that makes excellent use of one of the Super NES's most celebrated features, Mode 7, a major buzzword back then and nowadays pretty much synonymous with classic gaming. But what is it exactly? Well, it's a Super NES graphics mode, but you probably guessed that much already. One that allows for just a single 256 colour layer for the background, but one that could be rotated, scaled, squashed, warped and any combination thereof, with a minimal hit to the CPU, giving rise to some of the era's most memorable graphical moments. This background layer was still made up of tiles like any other. In fact, we can take a look at one of the mazes from this game as it's stored in the system's memory, but using the built-in features of Mode 7, you can do all sorts of stuff with it that would otherwise be very difficult. Here, this game is of course making heavy use of rotation, and a little bit of scaling at the end of the level when the maze is finished. There is one problem though, one thing that limits Mode 7 compared to the other graphics modes, and that is that you are absolutely fixed at having just one background layer, so many advanced effects can't be achieved. It is completely impossible, for example, to have a rotating background, let's say a maze, over the top of a static background image. It just can't be done on the Super NES. But hold on a mo, I'm sure you've noticed this is on the Super NES and that's exactly what's happening. So how does it work? Well, it's clever use of sprites. Sprites are nearly always moving objects, often animated, usually representing the player, enemies, etc. in other games. Here, the ball is a sprite, but sprites are also being used to make up that background image, and yes, we can see the sprite layer on its own to get a better look. Sprites are made up out of the same sort of tiles stored in the memory as backgrounds. Using them to make a static image is unusual, but not conceptually that much different from normal backgrounds. Handily on the Super NES, sprites can easily be set to appear under a background layer as well as on top, or even, as in this case, selectively over the top of some colours but not others, making this effect possible. The sprites don't cover the entire screen, but they don't need to, just enough to pick out the detail. Some levels even have other moving sprites as well in the mix, like the fish on this level, and just for the final touch, some more HDMA trickery can be done to add a colour gradient at times too. On the Ball was far from the only game to do this kind of thing. Lots of games, Contra 3 springing straight to mind, did it too, but I really can't think of another that did it so well and so convincingly. Developers came up with endless ways to make use of Mode 7, limitations and all, but this has got to be one of the better ones outside of racing games. An underloved entry in the system's library, but the very definition of a limit pusher, doing what might seem impossible with some clever programming. Okay, more Mode 7 on the way with a very deep cut with a very long name: Tommy Moe's Winter Extreme Skiing and Snowboarding. Just by saying that name in full, I think I've already spent more time thinking about this game than anyone has done in the past 25 years, one that's been languishing in the bargain bin of history since it was released. It was called other things in other places, but well, let's not drag this out anymore. Mode 7 is used here in the way probably most people remember it, as a pseudo 3D landscape backdrop, but this does something that's quite difficult in Mode 7, it adds hills. Yes, okay, game sack precedes me here. You may have already seen other games that do this, but this one seems to run a lot better than anything else that tried the same thing. What's so special about adding Mode 7 hills? Well, to understand that really, let's think about the more straightforward case to start, the classic hill-free Mode 7 in Mario Kart. Here's the full background layer for Mario Circuit 1 as it's stored in the system's memory, a flat 2D map, the entire track in one overhead view. This is the exact track you see when playing the game, but it's given that 3D effect with some perspective trickery, done by progressively zooming in more and more as you move down the screen. The HDMA system changing the amount of Mode 7 scaling being done on the background image as each row of pixels is being drawn, giving a flat looking plane stretching off into the horizon. Add in some rotation, populate it with opponents and obstacles in the form of sprites, and you're ready for racing. The trouble is, this isn't really 3D, not in the way that modern polygon-based games are. It's just a 2D image that's been gussied up. There's height and width, but not really any depth. So how did Tommy Moe do it? I'm assuming it was his idea, it's his name on the box. Well, in short, he's faking it, but in a very elegant way. There's a few things going on here. Number one, the horizon is moving up and down, the Mode 7 part of the screen being made to start in different places, giving the impression of hill crests. Number two, the amount of scaling being done is being altered further down the screen, giving the impression of curves, rather than just continually changing at the same rate, squashing some bits and expanding others, creating foreshortening. And finally, sprites are being used to help the impression. The player and all the various obstacles are being drawn along with the apparent contours of the ground just to cap it off. Yes, it's not perfect, but it looks okay, and importantly, it's still fairly fast. Most of the other games on the Super NES that tried this are unbearably slow and jerky. They chug along, but this does well throughout. In fact, we seem to be getting a pretty solid 30 frames per second. Why is this so much better? Well, it keeps things simple, there's no rotation to worry about, and also the tracks are made up of repeating sections. It's not having to continually load in new track data like some of these games do. And finally, it just seems to be efficiently programmed. Well done, Tommy Moe. Not the best experience you'll have on the Super NES, a classic. Well, not really, but it does have quite a lot to recommend it, even if it does get repetitive fairly quickly. The game engine is brilliantly done and it's worth tracking down just to see it in action. Right then, moving on. Well, it's even more Mode 7, but you'd probably never guess it. Easily the best known game on this list. It's Jurassic Park.
Welcome to Jurassic Park.
Done by the UK's Ocean Software, the masters of the multi-genre big-name tie-in, it may not seem all that special at first. Another 2D top-down shooting thing, no shortage of these in the 16-bit era, nice looking but not revolutionary, but this though is merely a veneer for the real exciting part of the game because it soon turns into a genuine 90s style first-person shooter with a raycasting engine and texture mapping, one of the very few on this system. Doom is no doubt the best known of these here on the Super NES, but well, Doom made use of the Super Effects chip, the extra processor that gives the system enough oomph to make it all happen. But like everything featured here today, Jurassic Park doesn't have the benefit of this extra power, so how does it work? How is it even possible? There are a couple of things that make a shooter like this sort of difficult in Super Nintendo land. Number one, the CPU isn't all that powerful. Yes, it's a weirdly controversial point, there'll be arguments in the comments, but it's true. Whilst it's not quite as weak as it's sometimes made out to be, it is left behind by most of the rest of this generation in that regard. If you're going to do a first-person shooter on the Super NES, well, there's going to have to be some serious optimizations to make it playable. Which brings us on to the next point. The graphics architecture in the Super NES is far from ideal for this sort of thing. As I said before, the Super NES is a tile-based system. Great for 2D games, very efficient and easier to deal with for the programmer, but it makes something like raycasting very hard. Although this game is made up out of repeating elements, textures, objects, enemies, etc., the constantly shifting viewpoint of a 3D space means that you can't possibly make up the graphics from a limited number of tiles. The Super NES could handle a lot more tiles than older systems, that's true, but well, not that many, and even if it could, it would be a very stupid way of doing it. You can't really do these sort of graphics with tiles, unless, well, how about we use tiles as pixels? Is that even possible? Well, the Mode 7 background is a grid of tiles 128 high by 128 wide, giving an image potentially of 1024 pixels by 1024 pixels. Most games don't show the whole thing at once, of course, but segments of it are scrolled around and warped in whatever way to make a constantly changing background. But if we make each tile just one solid colour and then zoom out a bit so we can see them all at once, then we have an image made up solely out of tile blocks. Yes, it's hardly high definition, but it's passable, and the display can be gussied up a bit with some sprites around the edges. Why is this helpful? Well, this in effect becomes a bitmap display. We can control each pixel on the screen individually just by changing a single byte in the video memory. We don't even need to load in any new tiles, we just need to have one tile for each colour we need waiting in the memory. This means that drawing graphics becomes relatively fast, there's less overhead to deal with, and the CPU can focus on doing all the other hard stuff. There are different ways of doing this. Wolfenstein used a similar but different technique to do more or less the same thing, but this works okay and it's relatively fast too. I say relatively because we're still at less than 10 frames per second, but it is playable and in the end offers a decent experience to the player. The aim of Ocean Software here was to create a Doom-style game without a Super Effects chip, and it looks like they succeeded. Ocean may not have had the best reputation in the 90s, some of their later work was a bit irredeemably awful, but at one time they were known for their quirky but reasonable quality takes on major names, a category that Jurassic Park falls well into. A bit rough around the edges, but inventive. Right, the end is in sight. Time for the final act. What could it be? What is the ultimate in underappreciated Super NES showboating? Rendering Ranger R2, or I don't know, Rendering Ranger R2. It's hard to give something a big build-up when you don't know how to say it. Let's just call it the Manfred Trends masterpiece. Yes, the 8-bit action game auteur who made his name making the C64 sizzle, the man with the mullet, assembly hacker in the front, party in the back. He's the one behind this, and if you're familiar with his work, you know it's going to be good. Never released outside of Japan, ironically, if this game has gained any fame at all, it's for being so darn unknown. One of the rarest Super Famicom titles with prices to match, giving it some renown for that alone. Some games are rare for a reason, but this is not. It's an absolute stormer, a run-and-gun shooter hybrid that looks absolutely stunning from start to finish. Of course, there's no enhancement chip magic going on, that's the theme of this video after all, but with Madman Manfred doing the coding, well, that's as good as, isn't it? It's hard to pin down one thing that makes this game so amazing technically. There's so much happening, it's like Donkey Kong Country meets Yoshi's Island, but with a much darker tone. All the amazing graphics wizardry from both of these titles rolled into one lordly sprite-slamming banquet. Let's spear some of the most toothsome dainties, shall we? And I'll try and give you a flavour of the whole thing. The opening run-and-gun shooter section ends with this amazing sequence, a huge screen-filling spaceship taking off, a giant sprite turning as it rises. You could be forgiven for thinking that this was some sort of Mode 7 thing, but it's just a large sprite, pre-rendered in 3D and played back as an animation. Something similar happens with this Walker-style boss a little later, and once again in this core-destroying sequence. I don't think this style of graphics ever looked more stunning on the Super NES, even in the hands of the mighty Rare. Another amazing effect plays out at the beginning of level 7. It's easy to miss, but this very short sequence uses graphics mode 2's offset per tile capability, which basically allows for columns of tiles to be scrolled vertically, giving this ghostly demonic face its eerie shimmer. The thing is, usually this mode only allows for 2 background layers, unless you're Manfred Trends of course, in which case you can have 3, done with some very intricate timing. From this very promising start, level 7 shapes up to being perhaps the most mind-blowing of the whole game, and well, perhaps one of the very best moments in the entire 16-bit generation, really. It looks and sounds, well, absolutely incredible, scanning rapidly back and forth across the huge parallax cityscape, dense with enemy fighters, that amazing score pulsating all the while, and finishing up with a glorious Mode 7 skyscraper zoom. The sheer style and technical power on display here gets this game remarkably close to the heights of the Neo Geo or Capcom's CPS2 arcade system, the very top tier of 2D gaming before the next gen swept it all away in a tide of polygons. I could go on about this, the baffling scrolling effects which often seem to have more layers than really should be possible, the huge enemies, the clever and sometimes quite subtle Mode 7 tricks. There's so many coding coups and tricky techniques tossed around, it would take too long to list them all. And despite all this, there is amazingly little slowdown given the pace that it all happens at. We maybe shouldn't be too surprised though. The Super NES CPU, whatever its limitations, was based closely on the 6502, the same processor more or less as the NES and C64. If there was ever a man who knew how to get the most out of the 6502, it's Manfred Trenz. This game has not had the best reviews over the years, weirdly, at least for the gameplay, rather unfairly if you ask me, because it is a superb game. It's not officially part of the Turrican series, but it is a spiritual successor, one that retains so much of the formula that you could easily call it Turrican 4 or 5, or however you want to count the series. If you're a fan of Turrican, this is unmissable. It's never had any sort of re-release that I know of, no virtual console, and well, I doubt we'll be seeing it on the Switch Online anytime soon either somehow. A shame to be sure, but there are rumblings of some sort of Turrican remastering in the works. Maybe Rendering Ranger will be dragged along too. Yes, surely this is the end of the show now, but a couple of things before I scuttle off. Number one, well, it's Sonic on the Super NES. Yes, this has appeared as I'm making this video, and it looks superb. Various hacks have appeared before, but well, nothing quite like this. What seems to be quite an accurate recreation of the original game. I know people will mention it in the comments, so I thought I'd better stick this in at the end, at least for a brief hello. So far, this is very much an unfinished tech demo, playable, yes, but well nowhere near the full game. What there is though is very promising, and I am looking forward to a more complete version coming out when I'm sure I'll be able to give it a more in-depth look. And finally, here's some mangled F-Zero footage. Why? Well, just because I thought it was interesting. Yeah, whilst making this video, I thought, wouldn't it be fun if I could disable the scaling on a Mode 7 racing game and make it into a top-down view? Well, I did manage to jam a screwdriver into the code and alter the perspective, but well, it didn't work out quite as well as I had anticipated. There's more to it than that, it turns out, making this, well, completely unplayable, but kind of interesting to look at. Oh well, let's chalk that up to experience, and I'll say thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.